What is going on? I am Matt O'Leary back with another video, and today I want to get into an article that I saw that was the two best players the New York Jets could trade for. Now, one of these kind of makes a little bit of sense. The other, really not too much. Both are kind of positions of need. And I like the outside the box thinking. There are no quarterbacks on this list, so I would probably put Aaron Rodgers at the top if we're talking trade. But for a non-quarterback for either of these options, the positions that they attack, understandable, but I don't love the fit per se. But let's get into the one first that makes probably the most sense, and that's Chuck Clark, the 28-year-old safety from the Baltimore Ravens. The Jets, obviously, with Joe Douglas, have a connection with the Baltimore Ravens, so it wouldn't surprise you doing business with them. It is also a position of need for this New York Jets team, as they will more than likely look to improve that safety position. LaMarcus Joyner is a free agent. I would imagine that they're going to try to look to add at that position. And Jordan Whitehead is a potential cut candidate, as he'd free up $7.25 million. He has one more year left on his deal with a $2.5 million base salary, so really not all that costly at all. As I said, it's a position of need. He's a really solid tackler. I think that's one of his biggest strengths. He only missed 6.6% of his tackles in 2023. As in coverage, so he's okay. 69.2 reception percentage allowed, 237 yards, 2 touchdowns. So he really didn't allow a ton of yardage in coverage, and only 2 touchdowns, which is pretty good. The reception percentage is maybe a little bit on the higher side, but not awful. Obviously a serviceable player in coverage. He's really solid against the run, 101 tackles. He's had 80 plus tackles in the last 3 straight seasons. My biggest gripe with him is he just doesn't really create enough interceptions. He only has 4 picks in the last 4 seasons, which is pretty much since he's become a starter. 2019 is really when he got much more reps. He's been around with them since 2017. And the projected cost on this is a mid-round pick. And it's not a terrible idea. It really isn't, because you'd imagine, right, when you do most of these mocks, more often than not, and obviously these things change and, everyone has their preference, but more often than not, you see safety somewhere in the middle rounds when you see these mocks for the Jets, whether it's the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th round, somewhere in that window. And if you're saying I can take a 3rd round pick and turn it into someone who can start at this level in a guy in Chuck Clark, then that is something that could make some sense. Now, something that is a little bit up in the air for me is he plays both free safety and strong safety, but I think he's better suited as a strong safety with his play style. And if you have Jordan Whitehead already and plan on keeping him, which is obviously something that they could do, you have 2 guys who kind of play a similar style at the safety position, better coming down and making plays towards the line of scrimmage. So I don't think they complement each other very well. But if it was one over the, like if you're cutting Jordan Whitehead and freeing up that money and then trading for Chuck Clark, then I don't know if you would do it that way either, because you're going to have to spend in free agency. And depending on the cost, that again, that kind of leaves things up for grabs. So it complicates things a little bit, because most people would say, okay, you sign someone in free agency and then you draft one. And if you're trading for one, I'm assuming that's your veteran. And then number 2, you're trading one of the picks that you probably could have used, assuming it's like, let's say, a 3rd round pick. You're trading one of those picks that you could have used on that young safety in the draft. So again, I don't hate this idea, but there's some red flags or some flaws with it. It's okay. I wouldn't be absolutely in love if the Jets decided to, trade for Chuck Clark. I think he's solid. I would say, okay, I get it. What's next? Are you moving on from Jordan Whitehead, or are you going to have Chuck Clark play at free safety? And if that's the case, well, don't expect much interceptions from your back end if you're running out Whitehead at strong safety and Chuck Clark at free safety. That would, to Whitehead's credit though, that would probably, I would think, take his game up a little bit, because playing next to a 32-year-old LaMarcus Joyner, I don't think probably helped helped his cause, and maybe he bounces back in 2023. The other option, the second guy on this list, again, kind of a sneaky position of need, but not the kind of player they need at that position, and that's Hunter Renfrow. And he is the 28-year-old wide receiver from the Raiders, and if the Jets were to sign Derek Carr, then I get it. That's someone that he's comfortable with and he had some success with. This past year, only 330 yards in 10 games and 2 touchdowns, but in 2021 had over 1,000 yards, 9 touchdowns, and they had a really nice connection. The only problem is he's a 5'10 slot receiver. Elijah Moore is best suited in the slot. Garrett Wilson plays a lot in the slot. They don't need another short wide receiver. They need a big guy who can go, stretch the field, go down and make plays, assuming they're going to move on from Corey Davis. And if you're trading for Hunter Renfrow, what do you think? You're not going to also keep Corey Davis at that salary too. He has a base salary of $6.5 and $11.2 million over the next 2 years. He's under contract and then has a couple of void years after that. And also, like, from the Raiders' perspective, it would cost them like a nice chunk in dead money against the cap if they did decide to move him. So I don't really see him as a trade candidate. And again, is he a nice player? Yeah, absolutely. I think, it was a little bit of an anomaly this past year. He's a little bit banged up, so the injuries scare me slightly with him, but I just don't think this is the kind of guy that the Jets need. Now, if you were talking about wide receivers that you could trade for, we mentioned on the podcast earlier, last week's episode, Cortland Sutton, which is someone who fits more of what the Jets would be looking for. You're losing Corey Davis, and you'd be replacing him with a guy who does something similar with his size. You could say, well, if you cut Braxton Berrios, this would be the Berrios replacement, but that's a really expensive Braxton Berrios replacement, and I would assume that you would want to have Renfrow in your starting trio. And just, again, he's a nice player, but I want Elijah Moore back inside more. He played on the outside way too much last year, in my opinion, and that would be a really small receiving core outside of Garrett Wilson, who, yes, he's not like a big dominant guy in that regard, but it would be nice to have someone who could complement them. And you could say, oh, maybe Denzel, but I really hope Denzel Mims turns into that guy, but I don't want to trust that or bet on that. In a similar boat to Mekhi Becton, I'm rooting for both those guys. I like both of those guys a lot, actually, but I don't think the Jets could afford to bet on those two guys after their last 2 seasons. Mekhi with the injuries, but he looked great as a rookie, but injuries just really derailed him. And Denzel Mims flashed as a rookie as well, but then, he had a season from hell in 2021, and then this last year, penalties and drops still a little bit of an issue for him. And there were some nice moments, there were some nice catches that he's had, but neither of those two guys did it anywhere close to consistently enough where I'd say, okay, I feel comfortable running it back with one of those two guys. Again, for just me personally. So I'm going to pass on Hunter Renfrow. Relatively intrigued for Chuck Clark. Not my preferred trade targets, I guess. Clark makes a little bit more sense. Renfrow really doesn't make much sense at all, in my opinion, but I want to hear from you. You let me know your thoughts on these trade options down below. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I am Matt O'Leary. Subscribe if you're new, and I will catch you next time.